Awesome.
Hi, everyone. Jonathan Alexander here with the Los Angeles Review of Books, and I am really excited to have with me Adrienne Maree Brown, who is the author of numerous books and articles. Most importantly, I think, the books Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change and Changing Worlds, and the most recent Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good. So, Adrienne, thank you so much for chatting with me. Tell me a little bit.
Thanks for having me, John.
No, not at all.
It's good to be here.
Tell me a little bit about how you came to work on pleasure activism.
I think if I look back, I was always a pleasure activist. Like there's something in my nature that was drawn towards delight and contentment, happiness. Like I've always been interested in like, how do we get that? How do we feel that? When I was in my 20s, I went to work at the Harm Reduction Coalition. And there, while I was there, I met this man named Keith Kyler, who had founded Housing Works in New York. And I heard him say the phrase pleasure activism. And I was like, what? That's a thing. Like you can be about justice inside of pleasure. Sorry, I just ate some lunch. And so that moved me. And then years passed and I started to notice these trends of being in movement spaces where no one was talking about pleasure or sex or drugs, or they were hiding it. Or if it showed up, it was showing up as like numbing and addiction. And like, and then especially as Me Too started taking off, I was like, I want to write things that help us move through this moment, this reckoning, without desexualizing ourselves. And it, in the same way as like, I want to move into conversations around drugs that are not like, no drugs is better, but it's like, well, what's the harm reduction approach? And like, how do we get to be our whole selves and be in right relationship with each other inside of these conversations? So all of that led to pleasure activism. And I also want to name that I was reading this text from Audre Lorde called The Uses of the Erotic as Power. It feels like a foundational text because she really heightened it for me to understanding that it's about freedom. It's about like, how do we understand our aliveness? Like when it actually comes on board, how do we understand just how powerful that is and how it actually makes it impossible to settle for suffering? And, I was like, oh, like these feelings it's not just about, oh, this feels good for this moment. It's about cultivating a life that feels good as a measure of how we have reclaimed freedom from those who seek to oppress and marginalize us and make us into consumers rather than lovers, right? So all of that.
There's so much there, and it's just really beautiful. I love the emphasis on pleasure is not just the reward you get for having done a good job, but the pursuit of good life and of ethical living as well. Yes. And I think that's an important part of your work. Yeah. You mentioned Audre Lorde, who just is there anyone better?
I'm literally wearing an Audre Lorde shirt right now.
Oh, that's awesome.
Like maybe you can see this.
Yes, I can.
The Homegirl Handbox, I think is what they name it. I'll send you the link so you can include it for your folks. But there's this Homegirl box group that makes these shirts, and they just sent it to me, and I was like, Audre.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So important. So much of your work is inspired by not just feminist traditions, but specifically Black feminist traditions, people of color feminism, queer of color feminist thinking. Octavia Butler, a huge source point for you. How did you fall in love with Octavia Butler?
How could you not?
I'm with you. I'm with you. What was your entrance point?
I'm just like, I read her. But like, I think that, like looking back, I feel like the first piece I read from her was The Parable of the Sower. And then I got to meet her and see her give a talk when I was still in undergrad at Columbia University. She came and spoke. And I remember it's like one of my crystal clear memories from a period where not that much is clear, getting to meet her and talk with her. And I was so moved by how she was practicing like what I was longing to express or longing to say, which is like, I'm not a sidekick and my life is not unimportant to the story. And actually, I think I have some massive belief systems and I think they should be contended with and taken seriously. And I think we should all be working in cooperation and collaboration and like symbiosis. And I think we should be learning from nature. Like there was all this stuff that was already bubbling in me. And I felt like she was pouring it into this fiction that made it very accessible. Like this is a future that the thing I first understood was like, she makes the future compelling, even though it's not necessarily easy. And we don't have an easy future ahead of us. Just based on what we've done to the climate alone, we have consequences ahead of us. We have consequences around letting go of white supremacy and moving past it and moving past this economic system and moving past the prison industrial complex. Like we had consequences and hard times, but there are ways to make it compelling. And I was so moved by how she did that. And I was like, I think both what she offered needs to be contended with, and then we also need to be in the practice of continuing the work because she died too early. She didn't get to tell all the stories. We have to keep telling the stories. We have to keep writing the future that is compelling for the species.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm so glad that Parable of the Sower is a book that you mentioned. I just taught it last term in a course on feminist utopias. And I wanted to, in particular, teach this book for students, for young people at this time, you know, of pandemic, all kind of lockdown. And I wanted them to see, here's somebody confronting difficulty, challenges. And yet, Lauren uses her words in that novel to shape change. And it's not going to be easy, but it can involve pleasure. And it can involve, I love how you talk about it as being compelling. You know, these are so important at this moment. I was also thinking of, besides the traditions in which you were writing and thinking, I remember one of my first real intimate encounters with my lover, who then became my husband. And, you know, the pursuit of a good orgasm. I thought, you know, when I had my first real orgasm with him, and I thought, God, why would we not just do this all the time? And how many problems would that solve?
I really do. I mean, I think I've said this before, but I really do think that there's so much that happens in the world that is because people have not tapped into the pleasure that is possible within their own bodies. And because people have bought into these false ideas that they can like buy it, or they can like dominate their way into it or win it or something. And it's like, it really is just like you turn in and you listen and like your landscape is there. Your landscape of pleasure is there. And it's quite liberating when you realize that, you know, you don't have to go outside yourself and it works for anybody. It doesn't matter what you look like, smell like, whatever. It's just like, this is available. And it's not always sexual pleasure, but there is something about the orgasm that for me, like, I'm just like, it does set a clarity where it's just like, this requires a certain amount of surrender, a certain amount of presence. And then there's something where it's like, oh, there's real and there's fake. You can really tell the difference. And lately I keep saying, I don't want a fake orgasm of a climate policy. Like, I'm like, once you feel real stuff, real pleasure, real satisfaction, you don't want to settle for the false shit. You're just like, that's not going to be good enough. And I'm excited for more of our species to awaken into that authentic, full-bodied, that authentic, intimate experience of pleasure. I do think it will end wars and it will end crises and it will change the economy and everything else. So I have a long vision for this.
Absolutely. It's going to take a long time. So important. As you're talking, I'm hearing you talk about setting aside the kind of quick and easy consumerist pleasures that our culture just doles out to us all the time. And pursuing what I've called diligent pleasure, because it takes practice. It takes practice. So two final questions. First, how would you respond to folks who say, well, you know, we have to just have our needs met first before we can think about something like pleasure?
Yeah. I don't think of it as separate from getting our needs met. You know, like I think of it as all connected. I think that we sometimes can discount that there's a need for happiness and satisfaction and connection and contentment. Like these things they're as biological as anything else. So I feel like this past year has been actually such a good teacher of that. That it's like you might be in your house, you have shelter, you have food, you have water, all of that might be happening, but the amounts of loneliness, the amounts of wild risks that people have taken from loneliness and from longing for connection, how it feels to actually have your needs, your whatever material needs met, but still not be able to connect and to touch, to hug, to hold people. I hope that a lot of people are able to put that together, that I'm like, this teacher shows, for me, I spent 3 months in Hawaii on sabbatical, all by myself, no human touch. It was the first time in my life, as far as I can remember, consider that happened. And I was like, I never want to be in a day without human touch again. Like I can't thrive that way. Like even with all the needs met and the ocean right there and everything, I was like, I need to be held so that I can grieve, so that I can hunger, so that I can feed someone. There's just, we are an interdependent species. So we're not getting our needs met if we're not interdependent.
Yeah, just sharing the pleasure of food with friends during the pandemic in our
Yes.
pod has been one of the life-saving things, I think.
I mean, it's such a pleasure. And, we figured out innovative things, like I cooked with people who were far away, like we'll cook the same meal and eat it together at the same time. I made love from a distance. I have a circle of girlfriends who we took baths together because we were like, normally we would be going to like hot springs or hot tubs, or that's what we do together for our vacations. And we're just like, okay, well, let's all get in our bathtubs, put on a face mask and be with each other. So I'm like, that longing is there, and we find ways to meet it. And even for introverts, I feel myself to be much more on an introversion level of the scale. So parts of this year have not been that hard for me, but even for someone like me, I'm like, yeah, human touch is actually non-negotiable. It's why we're born into someone else's hands.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
So your work is so powerful, and you have collected together so many amazing voices that speak to the political and personal power of pleasure.
Yeah.
Whom can you recommend for us? Whom are you reading? Who is pushing your own thinking about intimacy, sex, gender?
Yeah, I mean, obviously go read that essay by Audre Lorde, because I think it will shift the frame with which you look at everything else. I just finished this book, Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski, which I believe is the second edition. And it's really about normalizing so many aspects of sex from a scientific point of view. Like it's really like all bodies have the same parts, differently arranged. No two are the same. Your body is normal. Your genitals are normal. Your orgasms are normal. If you're struggling to have an orgasm, that's normal. It just like, she's like, here's all the science of this stuff. And here's what leads to great intimate relationships between people when you have all these different factors going on. And in the second edition, I feel like, I've heard that she didn't do the greatest job in the first edition around gender beyond, talking about women. And, I know that's difficult because I'm like, if you're looking at, she's writing from her own scientific scholarship. And so she's like, this is what I've studied. Here are the results. But I feel like she did a better job with the second edition, because there was nothing in me that was like, oh, I was like, oh, she's really thinking about all possible bodies here, and how do we get in right relationship with the bodies that we have. And then her science is mostly focused on like what happens for women with orgasm, what happens for women with pleasure. But it's not exclusive. It didn't feel exclusive to me. I'm curious to see what folks think about it who read both texts. But I think it's a really powerful read. It has really great tools in there around like what accelerates you towards pleasure and what puts the brakes on it. And how can you, I think so often we're like, oh, we just, these two people have different libidos, or these two people, are incompatible or whatever. But it's like this, I think, changes the kind of conversation a couple can have, or a pairing or grouping can have around the pursuit of pleasure together. So.
That's wonderful. I'll definitely check it out.
Cool.
I've been talking to Adrienne Maree Brown, the author of Pleasure Activism, the politics of feeling good. Adrienne, thank you so much for chatting with me.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan, and thanks for everyone for tuning in.